July 7, 1968. 10 a.m. The line stretched for 17 blocks. 17 blocks of people waiting to say goodbye to Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, Bumpy, the king of Harlem. Dead at 63 from a heart attack at Wells Restaurant on 132nd Street, face down in his chicken and rice, gone before the ambulance arrived. They started gathering at dawn. Old women in their Sunday best, young men in sharp suits, children holding their parents' hands, hustlers and preachers, doctors and dishwashers, the famous and the forgotten. By mid-morning, the crowd had swelled to over 7,000 people. By noon, the police had stopped counting. They came from everywhere, from the brownstones of Strivers Row and the tenements of the poorest blocks, from the jazz clubs and the churches, from political offices and prison cells. They came in Cadillacs and on foot, in silk dresses and work clothes, with diamonds on their fingers and holes in their shoes. They came because Bumpy Johnson was dead, and they needed to be there when they put him in the ground. This is the story of the funeral that stopped New York. The day a gangster was buried like a king, and the city had never seen anything like it before or since. To understand that funeral, you need to understand what Bumpy Johnson meant to Harlem. Not the legend, the reality. The day-to-day truth of what he did and who he was to the people who knew him. He was a criminal. Everyone knew that. He ran numbers, controlled gambling, enforced his will with violence when necessary. He'd killed men. He'd spent years in prison. By any legal measure, by any standard of conventional morality, he was a menace to society. But Harlem didn't see him that way. They saw the man who paid their rent when they couldn't, who bought school supplies for kids who had nothing, who made sure the elderly got coal in winter and food when they were hungry, who employed people when nobody else would hire them, who provided loans without interest to families in crisis, who buried their dead when they couldn't afford funerals. They saw a man who'd risen from nothing, from a wooden shack in South Carolina, from the very bottom of American society, and built something that was his, something that couldn't be taken away. In a world that told black people they could never be anything, Bumpy Johnson was proof that they could be everything. He was their king, and now their king was dead. The news had spread through Harlem like wildfire on July 4th, Independence Day. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who'd given Harlem its independence from outside control, who'd fought Dutch Schultz and the Italian mob and corrupt police to keep the neighborhood in black hands, had died on the day America celebrated freedom. Bumpy had been at Wells Restaurant, his favorite spot on 132nd Street. He went there several times a week, had a regular table, knew the staff by name. It was one of the few places he could relax, be himself, not have to watch his back every second. He'd ordered his usual: fried chicken, rice and gravy, collard greens, a glass of sweet tea. Halfway through the meal, he'd put down his fork, touched his chest, said something nobody could quite hear, and then he was gone, slumped over in his chair. Dead before he hit the table. The restaurant erupted. Someone called an ambulance. Someone else called Mamie, his wife. A crowd gathered outside within minutes, but there was nothing anyone could do. Bumpy Johnson was gone, 63 years old. 4 decades of ruling Harlem, and it ended in a restaurant over a plate of chicken on the 4th of July. The next 3 days were a blur. Mamie handled the arrangements with the same dignity she'd shown throughout her 35 years with Bumpy. She chose the casket, polished mahogany with gold fixtures, the finest available. Cost more than most Harlem families made in a year, but Bumpy deserved the best. He'd always given the best to others. She chose the funeral home, Thomas Funeral Home on 132nd Street, the same place that had handled her mother's services a decade earlier. A Harlem institution for a Harlem king. She chose the cemetery, Woodlawn in the Bronx, one of the most prestigious cemeteries in New York, where jazz legends and political leaders were buried, where Bumpy would rest among equals. The word went out through every channel Harlem had, through the churches and the barber shops, through the numbers runners and the social clubs, through the newspapers and the whisper networks. Bumpy Johnson's funeral would be on Sunday. Everyone was welcome. Everyone was expected. And everyone came. The viewing was scheduled for 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. By 8:30, the line was already around the block. By 9:30, it had reached 125th Street, 8 blocks away. By 10:30, police were redirecting traffic because entire streets were impassable. Captain William Harris of the 28th Precinct had been on the force for 22 years. He'd worked dozens of funerals, including some for prominent figures. He'd never seen anything like this. "We had to call in reinforcements from 3 other precincts," he said later. "Not because there was trouble. There was no trouble. Everyone was peaceful, respectful. But the sheer numbers, we weren't prepared for that many people." Inside the funeral home, mourners filed past the casket in silence. Bumpy lay there in a charcoal gray suit, his favorite. White shirt, subtle tie, his hands folded across his chest, his face peaceful, more peaceful than most people had ever seen him in life. Whatever demons had driven him, whatever pressures had weighed on him, whatever fears and regrets and calculations had filled his mind for 63 years, they were gone now. He looked like a man who'd finally found rest. Some mourners prayed, some wept, some simply stood there, looking at the man who'd shaped their lives, trying to understand that he was really gone. An old woman named Bessie Mae Williams, 93 years old, was helped to the casket by her grandchildren. She'd known Bumpy since he was a teenager, newly arrived in Harlem with nothing but ambition and a burning refusal to accept his assigned place in the world. She'd watched him rise, watched him stumble, watched him rule, watched him become legend. She leaned over the casket and whispered something nobody else could hear. Then she kissed his forehead, patted his folded hands, and shuffled away. Later, her granddaughter asked what she'd said. "I told him thank you," Bessie Mae replied. "For 50 years, that man took care of us. When my husband died and I couldn't pay for the funeral, Bumpy paid. When my grandson got in trouble with the law, Bumpy got him a lawyer. When we had nothing to eat, Bumpy sent food. Somebody needed to thank him. So I did." The stories multiplied as the morning went on. A man who'd been a teenager in the 1930s, who Bumpy had pulled off the streets and given a job when he was headed for prison or death. A woman whose mother had been dying of cancer, who Bumpy had sent to a specialist in Manhattan and paid for every treatment. A family who'd lost their apartment in a fire, who Bumpy had housed and fed and helped get back on their feet. Story after story. Testimony after testimony. A collective accounting of what one man had meant to one neighborhood over 4 decades. The procession began at noon. A black hearse carried the casket. Behind it, a line of cars that stretched for over a mile. Limousines, Cadillacs, Lincolns, and ordinary sedans. Hundreds of vehicles carrying mourners to the cemetery. But most people didn't ride. They walked. 7,000 people walking through the streets of Harlem behind Bumpy Johnson's hearse, moving slowly, solemnly, filling the streets from sidewalk to sidewalk. Traffic stopped. Businesses closed. The entire neighborhood came to a standstill. The route took them through the heart of Harlem, down Lenox Avenue, past the shops and restaurants and bars where Bumpy had held court, past the corners where his runners had worked, past the churches whose pastors had accepted his donations while publicly condemning his profession. At every corner, more people joined, stepping out of buildings, emerging from side streets, adding their bodies to the river of mourners flowing through the neighborhood. A young reporter named James Edwards, writing for the Amsterdam News, walked with the procession and took notes. "It wasn't a funeral," he wrote later. "It was a pilgrimage." These people weren't just mourning. They were paying tribute to their king. I've seen funerals for mayors and congressmen that didn't draw crowds like this. What struck me most was the diversity. Old and young, rich and poor, People who'd clearly known Bumpy personally, walking alongside people who'd only known him by reputation. And the silence. 7,000 people, and you could hear your own footsteps. Nobody was talking. Nobody was crying loudly. Just this quiet, dignified procession through streets that had seen so much joy and so much pain over the years. The famous faces were there too. Politicians who'd publicly denounced organized crime walked alongside men who'd committed it. Businessmen in three-piece suits walked next to hustlers in flashy colors. Church deacons walked next to known criminals. And there were white faces, Italian faces, men who'd flown in from Las Vegas and Miami and Chicago to pay their respects. Made men from the five families, walking openly through Harlem to honor a black gangster they'd called an equal. Frank Costello sent a wreath of white roses so large it took 4 men to carry. The note read, "To the gentlemen of Harlem. Rest in peace." The cemetery was Woodlawn in the Bronx. By the time the procession arrived, the crowd had grown even larger. People who hadn't been able to join the march had come directly, filling the cemetery grounds until there was no space left. The police estimate was 10,000. Some said it was more. The graveside service was simple. Reverend Dempsey of Abyssinian Baptist read scripture, spoke about redemption, about a God who judges the heart, not the occupation, about a man who'd done wrong but also done right, and whose final judgment was not for mortal men to make. Mamie Johnson stood at the front, dignified in black, surrounded by family and close friends. She didn't cry. Not here. Not now. She'd cried enough in private. Today she would be strong. Today she would show Harlem that Bumpy's queen didn't break. When the coffin was lowered into the ground, something happened that nobody expected. A sound rose from the crowd. Not crying, not wailing, a hum. A deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The sound of thousands of voices expressing something that words couldn't capture. Loss, respect, love, grief. All of it merged into this single sustained note that filled the cemetery and echoed off the headstones and seemed to hang in the air long after it stopped. It lasted for maybe 30 seconds. Then silence. Bumpy Johnson was in the ground. The king was dead. The aftermath of the funeral became its own legend. For the next week, Harlem was in a kind of suspended animation. Businesses opened late and closed early. People gathered on corners, not to work or hustle, but just to talk, to share stories, to try to make sense of a world without Bumpy in it. The newspapers covered the funeral, of course. The New York Times ran a story on page 17. The Daily News put it on page 5. They focused on the spectacle, the size of the crowd, the presence of known criminals, the disruption to traffic. They missed the point. James Edwards, the young reporter who'd walked with the procession, got it right in his piece for the Amsterdam News. What happened Sunday wasn't a funeral, he wrote. It was a coronation in reverse. For 40 years, Bumpy Johnson ruled Harlem. He did it without official power, without legal authority, without the legitimacy that society reserves for those it approves of. He ruled because people chose to follow him, because he earned their loyalty through decades of actually showing up when they needed him. The crowd that walked behind his casket wasn't mourning a criminal. They were honoring a king, their king, the one they'd chosen, the one who'd chosen them back. History will probably forget Bumpy Johnson. Or remember him wrong. Remember him as a gangster, a hoodlum, a menace to decent society. That's what the official record will say. But Harlem knows better. Harlem will remember the truth, that for 40 years one man stood between them and a world that wanted them to fail. One man fought for them, provided for them, protected them. And when that man died, 10,000 people stopped what they were doing and walked through the streets to say goodbye. That's not how you bury a criminal. That's how you bury a king. The grave still stands in Woodlawn Cemetery, a modest headstone that reads, Ellsworth, Raymond Johnson, 1905-1968, beloved husband and father. Nothing about his life, nothing about what he built, nothing about what he meant to Harlem. Just his name and the dates and a simple statement of his most important roles. But people still visit. Even now, more than 50 years later, flowers appear on the grave. Notes are left. People come to pay their respects to a man most of them never met, but somehow feel they know. Because the legend of Bumpy Johnson didn't die on July 4, 1968. It grew, passed down through generations. Told and retold until it became part of Harlem's DNA. The gangster who fed the hungry. The criminal who protected the innocent. The king who ruled without a crown but never without love. July 7th, 1968. 10,000 people, 17 blocks, one casket. The funeral that stopped New York. The day Harlem said goodbye to its king, and proved that some men are bigger than the laws that try to contain them. If this story of love, legacy, and the day a neighborhood stopped to honor one man moved you, smash that subscribe button. Drop a like if you understand that how a man is buried says more about his life than any biography ever could. What do you want people to say about you when you're gone? What do you want them to remember? Let me know in the comments. More legendary stories coming. Because Bumpy Johnson's story didn't end when his heart stopped. It became immortal. Just like the man himself. July 7th, 1968. The day Harlem buried its king, and the world finally understood what he'd meant to the people who loved him.